You're listening to Hoedown History, where we explore the history and legends of America's old time and bluegrass music. It's considered one of the most popular bluegrass instrumentals today, and it's a great tune. It's been played and recorded by a countless number of bluegrass bands, and it's definitely a favorite at local jam sessions as well. And in this video, we'll discuss some of the forgotten origins of this tune, which are shrouded in a bit of mystery. And unlike some of my other videos on these old fiddle tunes, this one doesn't actually appear to be all that old. We're not going to find any original 17th century sources in Ireland or Scotland on this one. And I was kind of surprised to find out that its popularity is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. And the key musicians who have had a hand in popularizing and transforming this tune to the version we know of today are nowadays mostly forgotten. Mainly because these two pivotal recordings are not actually found in any bluegrass records. And so let's dive in and listen to some square dance recordings. Our search for the source of Cherokee Shuffle starts with a tune with a different name that was recorded in 1949 by Roy Acuff with Tommy Magnus on fiddle, or at least who most music historians believe to be Tommy Magnus. And it's this Tommy Magnus that's considered by many to be the arranger of this original tune as well, which eventually went on to be transformed to create our modern day version of Cherokee Shuffle. And I'll play both his version and Cherokee Shuffle side by side in a bit so you can hear it for yourself. But first, let's discuss who this fiddler even was and how this recording came about. Magness was born in 1916 near the North Georgia community of Mineral Bluff, in the mountains not far from the Tennessee line. This was also the area where Fiddle and John Carson was from, who lived just a few miles to the east. Most of Magnus's musical influence seems to have come from family and local musicians in the North Georgia hills. Tommy's father was a farmer and gardener and played the banjo as well. And the banjo was Tommy's first instrument, too. According to family legend, Tommy, at age 3 or 4, would stand in a chair while he held the instrument and tried to learn to play new tunes. And family lore also tells of his fascination with playing a sort of corn cob fiddle, one cob acting as the fiddle and the other as a bow. His older sister recalls, when he was a crawling baby, he played with those two cobs. I would joke on him and go hide those cobs, and he would just sit there and cry. Those two cobs suited him very well. Eventually, his father got the boy a real fiddle. Well, kind of. His sister recounts, the way it came about, we didn't have no toys, and when Daddy was working at Copper Hill, he built Tommy a fiddle, and I learned to play it. I learned the fiddle from watching Mother pick the mandolin. Daddy just played banjo. Then I taught Tommy when he was big enough. When he was 8 years old, his mother passed away, and by the time he was 9, Tommy was good enough to start playing in public with his fiddle. One of his first jobs was entertaining customers at a local hardware store, and soon Tommy was playing with some local bands throughout the area. When the Depression hit in the 1930s, times were tough on the Magness family, and Tommy, who was still just a teenager, started working at a local blanket manufacturer to help keep food on the table. And he would also set out at times on his own, leaving home for a stretch with nothing but a fiddle and the clothes on his back. His widow later recounted, quote, when Tommy got so hungry and couldn't stand it, he would leave the home, take his fiddle into a cafe, and they asked him to play a tune. He did, and he said he got steaks or biscuits or anything he wanted. During Tommy's later childhood, the family moved back and forth to North Carolina. And around 1932, when Tommy was 16, he quit school and moved to Canton, North Carolina, near Asheville. Over the next few years, Tommy would go on and work at a local mill, but he also sought work playing at a local radio station as well. But finding work as a fiddler during this time was getting a little bit tougher. By the mid 1930s, the so called golden age of old time fiddling was in decline. There were fewer and fewer programs featuring exclusively fiddle music, even in the mountains, and the fiddle was being relegated to just a backup role for the new breed of entertainers, the vocalist. The typical radio show now featured a smooth voiced singer, a comedian, duet singers, and maybe one or two short token fiddle breakdowns. In one sense, Tommy was hitting the media just about a decade too late. But by the spring of 1938, Tommy met one of these singers who had a popular radio show called Roy Hall. Hall had a band called the Blue Ridge Entertainers, and they needed a new fiddler. Tommy accepted the invitation, and soon this band landed a spot on a radio station in Winston-Salem, which was sponsored by Dr. Pepper. The band was a hit, and soon enough, Roy Hall would become one of the most popular singers in the Carolinas. And listeners were also paying more and more attention to the fiddler backing up Roy's band. And it was with this band that Magnus made his first recordings in 1938 for the old record company. Tommy continued to work with the Hall Band until 1940, when he joined another major string band which was in the process of defining itself, called Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. Monroe had gotten a slot on the Grand Ole Opry in late 1939, and Monroe was attracted to Tommy's fiddling, especially his drive and loose bluesy style. Monroe once stated of Magnus, quote, "He had that fine old-time touch, rich and pure, but he was able to put a touch of the blues to it as well. He was the first man I heard play Orange Blossom Special, and he could put a lot more in it than they do today. He taught me the song The Hills of Roane County, and I taught him to play Katy Hill in the bluegrass way." He would go on to play with Monroe for just a short time. By 1941, he was back with Roy Hall, who offered him more money than Bill, who was just paying him the union minimum. All this running around took a toll on his marriage, which by now had fallen apart. And in 1942, he remarried a Virginia girl named Tootsie Poindexter. And throughout the early years of World War II, Tommy Magnus continued to work with Roy Hall for Dr. Pepper in Roanoke. Then tragedy struck. Roy Hall was killed in an automobile accident on May of 1943. Several months before, however, Tommy had decided to leave the band after 2 years broadcasting and moved to Louisville, where he appeared on the Early Morning Frolic show. And after about a year of this, though, he received an offer to return to Nashville, not to work for Bill Monroe, but for an even bigger name, Roy Acuff. Acuff, of course, was himself a fiddler, and had in fact first won his job in the Opry as a fiddler back in 1938. But now his forte was his distinctive singing style, and as he became more and more popular in the early 1940s, he found himself doing a number of jobs. He was master of ceremonies, lead singer, band leader, songwriter, actor, businessman, and founder of Acuff Rose Publishing, the company that laid the foundation for the modern Nashville music business. By 1944, he had decided that while the fiddle was still a key part of the Smoky Mountain sound, he no longer really had time to do it himself. For the first time in his career, he decided to hire a fiddler. After hearing Tommy's mellow mountain style and the way he had backed up Roy Hall's vocals, he made him an offer. Tommy accepted at once. When Tommy and his family drove to Nashville in 1944, Roy was the most popular country singer in America. His Prince Albert portion of the Grand Ole Opry was heard every Saturday night at 9:30. His Republic feature films were seen in theaters across the country. His tent shows and stadium tours played to thousands more. His Columbia and OK singles were constantly in the top of 10 of the Billboard charts. Tommy fit in well here, and for the next several years became probably the most widely heard old-time fiddler in the nation. And this brings us to our legendary recording. In May of 1949, Acuff released a 78 RPM album called Old Time Barn Dance. This album was part of a nationwide square dancing fad that was beginning to pick up steam in the late 1940s, and it was sweeping the country by storm. and one of the tunes released on this album was called Lonesome Indian. Give it a listen. So, as you can plainly hear, the two tunes are obviously related, at least the A parts. And most music historians seem to be pretty much in agreement on this one, namely that our A part of Cherokee Shuffle derives from Magnus's version of Lonesome Indian. You may have noticed that both the A and the B part of this tune are basically the same melody, with the B part just being played up an octave. And we'll get to the origin of Cherokee Shuffle's B part in a bit, but we should probably first discuss the question of where Tommy Magnus got his version from, and answering this question is a bit of a mystery, and not without some controversy. But there are several theories out there. One is that some believe Tommy Magnus, who was in fact inspired by many other fiddlers in the Tennessee area, may have gotten this tune from, or at least adapted it from, a version of an older tune called Lost Indian. And in fact, many, even up until today, associate Lonesome Indian with Lost Indian. And there are even many later recordings by other musicians that have basically copied Magnus's tune entitled Lost Indian. But there's some difficulty with tracing this tune to Lost Indian because the fact is, there are many, many tunes called Lost Indian, some with just completely different melodies. As one music collector once stated, he liked to ask different fiddlers to play Lost Indian for him, and in all of his years of collecting old fiddle tunes, he says he never heard the same melody twice. And the melody isn't the only thing that's different with our many versions of Lost Indian. You'll also note that many of them are in completely different keys. While Magnus recorded Lonesome Indian in the key of D, many other regional variations of Lost Indian are played in the key of A, or for my fiddle listeners, with the fiddle tuned to A, E, A, C sharp. And it seems that Lost Indian appears to be just a generic or floating title for a number of tunes that are related not so much by the melody itself as by the fact that they're usually played in this type of scordatura tuning. Here's a recording of Lost Indian performed by Louis Props from 1936, and see if you can make out any similarity to Lonesome Indian or even Cherokee Shuffle. So there's not much there to really connect it to Magnus's Lonesome Indian. And I've listened to dozens of old regional versions of Lost Indian, and none of them come much closer to our Lonesome Indian either. And the more recent Lost Indian versions that are similar appear to actually have been derived from Magnus's Lonesome Indian, just to add some more confusion to this whole thing. So, while the two tunes are frequently associated with each other, there's no actual definitive relation that I could find between them. And of course, there is the possibility that perhaps Magnus did derive his version from, for lack of a better term, a lost Indian regional variation that may never have been recorded. But many historians also believe that Magnus simply composed Lonesome Indian himself. And that does seem to be a pretty popular theory. And I should probably mention one more theory, which is that there are a few people out there who believe Magnus may have been influenced by another tune altogether. Some of my old time listeners may be familiar with it. It's called The Colored Aristocracy. This tune dates back to the late 1800s or early 1900s, and it's usually categorized as a cakewalk tune. And I'll play both tunes side by side. So there is some similarity there, but again, it's just a theory, and to my knowledge, there hasn't been any real research done to prove this source theory. So, while we don't really know where the origins of Lonesome Indian may have ultimately come from, we do know where our modern version of Cherokee Shuffle comes from. But Tommy Magnus's Lonesome Indian just gives us part of the story, and we still need to answer some other questions like where did the B part of Cherokee come from, and why are these two tunes played in different keys? And how did Cherokee Shuffle even enter the bluegrass tradition in the first place? And to answer these questions, we need to look to another almost forgotten fiddler who's also named Tommy as well. And the story's interesting because this fiddler, in addition to being our source for Cherokee Shuffle, is also one of the first musicians to help pioneer a whole new industry within the music world. An industry that continues to shape not just bluegrass, but country music as a whole up to the present day. So let's dive into the story behind our first recording of Cherokee Shuffle. And the fiddler we can thank for this legendary recording is this man, Tommy Jackson. Jackson may not be a household name for many of my listeners, but don't let that deceive you because, well, according to one prominent music historian, Charles Wolfe, he just might be the artist to have played on more records than any other fiddler in history. You see, during the 1950s and 60s, Jackson was the go to studio musician in Nashville, and his fiddling can be heard today on a countless number of country bands who recorded during this time period. And his versatility was stunning. He could play along with any style of country music of the time, from classic honky tonk with Hank Williams to Western swing with Bob Wills, to the ragged sound of Grandpa Jones to the smoother Nashville sound of Tammy Wynette. He was a sideman to them all, and many others who recorded in Nashville during this time period. And of course, he could also be found fiddling with some of our classic bluegrass artists as well, like Bill Monroe, Mac Wiseman, the Osborne brothers, and Jim and Jesse. But who was this Tommy Jackson, and how did his recording of Cherokee Shuffle even get made? Jackson was born in Birmingham in 1926, but his family moved to Nashville when he was barely one. He grew up listening to the Grand Ole Opry in the early 30s. While Jackson's grandfather and some of his uncles had been old time fiddlers, there wasn't much contact with music growing up in his family. His father was a barber, and when young Tommy started showing some interest in the fiddle, his father encouraged him. He started taking him to the local Nashville bars when he was only 7 years old, and his father would sit him up on the bar counter to play music for some nickels and dimes. And when he was just 10 years old, he formed his own band with a neighbor who played guitar, and a couple of cousins who played mandolin and bass. As Jackson recounts of this time, quote, those were pretty hard times back then. And the four of us would go down to a street corner in downtown Nashville where we'd start playing and pass the hat around. You'd be surprised at how much money we'd get. Of course, the cops would eventually run us off, but we'd just run off to another street corner, pass that hat, and start playing all over again. They'd call themselves the Tennessee Mountaineers, and before long they would find themselves playing regularly every Saturday night on a Nashville radio station, WSIX, with a program called The Old Country Store. They got paid $1.50 for each show, which was good money back then, but it wasn't as much as passing the hat around on a street corner. So they found out they could hit the streets right before getting on the air, and that hat could collect as much as $40 or $50 a week. Throughout his high school years, Jackson continued to play on the radio and at square dances and beer taverns with other groups in the area. So that by the time he graduated, he was a seasoned musician. And at the age of 17, he started playing regularly on the Grand Ole Opry with some Western swing bands. But it was a short stint, as he soon enlisted in the Army Air Corps during the war. His wartime years consisted mostly of crouching in the tail gunner's turret of a B-52 over the Pacific. When he was finally discharged in 1946, he resumed his work as a freelance full-time professional musician for a number of touring bands. But life on the road wasn't much to his liking, so he got a gig with Milton Estes and his musical Millers, who were just starting a radio program on WSM. It was sponsored by a company called Martha White Flower, and some of my listeners will be familiar with this program when it featured another band about a decade later. Then the next year later, he started working with Red Foley, who also had a show on WSM. During the late 40s, Red Foley was emerging as one of the leading singers in the nation, and this is when everything came together for Jackson. You see, during this time, big record producers were coming into Nashville to use the recording studios that were slowly developing. And since Jackson and the others in Foley's band were basically the only Nashville band to stick around the city year-round, they soon became known as the go-to pickup band for recording artists stopping by in Nashville. And through this odd combination of circumstances, Jackson and the Red Foley band musicians were the pioneers of a very new type of music profession, becoming the first real Nashville studio band, or as Dell likes to call them, the first real Nashville Cats. And one of Jackson's first recording sessions as a studio musician was a big one. In 1947, he helped record 4 sides for the Alabama singer Hank Williams. Ever wonder who created that great fiddle intro in Hank's version of I Saw the Light? Yep, that was Tommy Jackson. More were to follow with Hank, including Move It On Over, Hank's first ever big hit. In addition to playing fiddle on recordings from Ernest Tubb to, back again, Roy Acuff, among his favorite people to record with was Faron Young, on whose recordings Jackson popularized that ever-classic double-stop backup technique that's still used in a lot of bluegrass bands today. And like many Nashville studio musicians, Jackson's personal musical preferences went far beyond country styles of music. He especially liked jazz and the swing fiddling of Bob Wills, and would eventually record with Wills in the 1960s. And he also liked the music of the French violinist Stéphane Grappelli, who worked with Django Reinhardt and the Hot Club of France. And you could hear a lot of that jazzy influence in his playing. Okay, but where does Cherokee Shuffle fit in all of this? Remember that big square dance craze in 1949 with Tommy Magnus and Acuff's recording of Lonesome Indian? This craze continued throughout the 1950s and was especially popular with the middle class during this period. And by this time, clubs were springing up throughout the country to host these dances. And there was more and more this need for canned square dance music that a local caller could use when calling a dance. And by this time, most of the fiddle records were on 45s or 78s, which could play about 3 minutes a side. But the new LPs were longer, which could run about 20 minutes a side. And so Jackson's LPs filled this need. And by the 1960s, he had recorded a bunch of square dance records, 11 LPs and 30 singles in total. They were widely popular at the time, and they sold very well, leading some music historians to believe that this may have made Jackson the most heard and imitated fiddler of his generation. And it was in 1958 that Tommy would record a tune that was basically a transformation of Tommy Magnus's Lonesome Indian. By many accounts, it appears that Jackson took this Lonesome Indian tune, which was originally in the key of D, and for some reason unknown to me, changed it to the key of A. But he also added a new B part. While the Magnus's B part was basically the A part played up an octave, Jackson's B part is a whole new melody, even with some extra measures thrown in as well. It's noted for its unusual length of 10 measures instead of the more standard 8. And along with the whole new B part came a whole new name that still played into that whole American Indian theme. Here's Tommy Jackson's 1958 recording of Cherokee Shuffle, and it's just great. And when you listen to this version, you'll notice how clean and straightforward, but still driving his playing style is. Jackson may not have been the most virtuosic fiddler, but with that clean, no-frill style, it was easy for other fiddlers to pick out the melody in order to imitate. Jackson was even quoted as saying that, well, quote, "I always kept the tunes as simple as possible because I was selling a beat." And the sound quality is also impeccable. The fiddle just cuts through, clear and full. And a lot of fiddlers wondered how Tommy got that special tone on his recordings. And some of it was done in the studio. Tommy once explained that instead of putting a slapback on the bass, they put the slapback on his fiddle, which helped give it that delay and added to that richer sound. And it's also important to note how important his records were, because during this time period of the 1950s, rock and roll was just, well, steamrolling the music world, and Tommy Jackson was one of the few fiddlers you could still hear on records and on the radio. Some historians believe Jackson was the only man to keep fiddling alive during those lean years when rock and roll was engulfing the country and bluegrass worlds. And if you were a fiddler growing up in the late 50s and 60s, it would be nearly impossible to avoid his influence. As time went on, though, Jackson grew increasingly frustrated with the music business as he felt pigeonholed by the music scene that prevented him from playing the type of music he really wanted to play. And by the 1970s, he felt mostly forgotten. He no longer picked up his fiddle to jam around the house, and he used to say that he got more publicity from the sports pages for his fishing catches than he ever did for his music. Jackson would eventually pass away in 1979 at the age of 53. But his legacy lives on today. His recordings are pretty great. And what I found kind of a shocker was that it would actually be several decades before this tune would actually find itself on any bluegrass records. Notable early recordings were made by Eddie Shelton in 1976 and Norman Blake with the Rising Fawn String Ensemble in 1979. But all things considered, while Cherokee Shuffle, which is today a standard and many musicians wrongly assume to be old as the hills, is actually a fairly recent addition to the bluegrass world. Like I mentioned in the intro, you'll be hard-pressed to find a bluegrass band recording it prior to 1980, or even 1990 for that matter. And what I also found kind of surprising is that in the old-time world, the most common versions of Lost Indian which are played today seem to be derived, or at least heavily influenced, by the two recordings we've just discussed, which aren't really that old, relatively speaking. And like Magnus's version, the old-timers usually play the tune in the key of D. But it's also common for them to add a third part, and sometimes to even include some of the melody of Cherokee Shuffle's beat part in there as well. And how this actually came about is a bit of a mystery, with many just attributing it to the folk process over time. And before I leave you folks, I should probably discuss the title to dispel any rumors that go floating around the internet. Like my previous videos on Red Wing or Indian War Whoop, Cherokee Shuffle and Lonesome Indian don't appear to actually have any real American Indian roots. The melody may sound Indian to our ears, but this seems to be pretty much the extent of anything related to any actual Native American culture. And so, no, Cherokee Shuffle doesn't appear to be about drunken Indians shuffling around in a daze. And sorry if you thought it was some old Indian chant or war dance tune, because it looks like it's just a fiddle tune that's been reinterpreted by a couple of fiddlers from Tennessee named Tony. That just sounds pretty cool. Well, that's all I got on Cherokee Shuffle. Hope you enjoy this one, and thanks for listening.